You can pick out the chart-topping songs of a decade, but that doesn't really clue you into what was going on music-wise in that decade if you're only ever looking at the greatest hits. Because chances are there was a song during that period of time that you and your friends who maybe lived through that era absolutely adored. You had it on repeat, but it never charted. So I feel the same way when it comes to 2000s quarterbacks. There's some guys out there who, if you look at it, no, they never won a conference championship. No, they never won a national championship. But they were guys of the time period that people were looking at. My first quarterback that I'm going to mention is the man who made me care about football at all, okay? If it wasn't for this guy, I would have never cared about football. Quarterback Reggie Ball, Georgia Tech. Now, Reggie Ball's career is kind of known because he threw just as many touchdowns as he did interceptions. He started over 40 games for Georgia Tech, which is crazy to think about. And he was the first freshman quarterback to ever start his first game in like a very long period of time for Georgia Tech. And he's also known for never beating Georgia, which was a big deal. But for me, what I loved about Reggie Ball was he was 5'11" with shoes on and on a, standing on top of a, thing of books. And he didn't care how big you were. He had a heart of a lion. He was going to show up every single Saturday and put on a show for you. Now, he might have a game where he has 1 touchdown and 3 interceptions, but that 1 touchdown was going to be a game winner. And that's what I loved about Reggie Ball. Like, he was just that dude at Georgia Tech. He had a lot of high expectations on him, and he is the reason that Calvin Johnson got as much notoriety as he did. Because he threw Calvin Johnson almost all of his touchdowns at Georgia Tech. But a lot of people forget about Reggie Ball. I don't. He's the reason that I care about college football. So that's my first guy, number 1, Reggie Ball. Second guy on my list is Phillip Rivers. Now, in 2003, which was the year that I really started paying attention to football, there were 3 big quarterbacks coming out of that year. Phillip Rivers, Ben Roethlisberger, Eli Manning. Now, this could have been because of where I was living at the time, but for me, the quarterback that was big on my roster was Phillip Rivers at NC State. Yes, I did see some Eli Manning games. Yes, I caught the occasional Ben Roethlisberger game. But Phillip Rivers was that dude. Everybody compared him to Dan Marino. They said he's going to be the next Dan Marino, which is kind of sad when you think about it because he went on to play for the Chargers for most of his career. Never won a Super Bowl like Dan Marino. Threw a bunch of touchdowns, threw for a bunch of yards like Dan Marino, but never really had the full team around him like Dan Marino. So I guess they were kind of on point with that one. But Phillip Rivers, I thought he was a very interesting quarterback. And I remember in 2003, young Reggie Ball, the freshman quarterback, went up against Phillip Rivers in Atlanta and beat him. And that was a time frame when there was a lot of Heisman hype around Phillip Rivers. And that game did a lot of damage to Phillip Rivers' Heisman hopes when he lost to young Reggie Ball in the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. So I remember that one quite fondly. Next up on my list, Chris Ricks from Florida State. You probably don't know Chris Ricks. He's not the Charlie Ward of Florida State. He's not the Chris Winkie of Florida State. But I remember him very fondly. He was one of the first quarterbacks I ever saw at Florida State. And he was somebody where my dad would yell at the TV when he did something right. And my dad would yell at the TV when he did something wrong. And he had a very up and down career at Florida State. But he was one of the last, in my opinion, one of the last good quarterbacks that Bobby Bowden had. Because after Bobby Bowden had Chris Ricks, he then had Drew Weatherford. And I believe he had Christian Ponder for a little bit of time, but then Jimbo Fisher came in. So Chris Ricks was kind of like the last of the really good quarterbacks for Florida State. He's hardly ever talked about, which is unfortunate, but he put his everything out there, and obviously the one team that always gave him struggles was Miami, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Brock Berlin at Miami. Now, Brock Berlin came in after Ken Dorsey and all those powerful Miami Hurricanes teams, and in my opinion, Brock Berlin was the last good quarterback that those powerful Miami Hurricanes had. And I'll tell you what, I can't spend a lot of time on this, but I will tell you, my dad hated when Miami played against his Florida State Seminoles. Brock Berlin, he was kind of a game manager, but he was a good one for Miami. Chris Leak from Florida. Now, Chris Leak and Reggie Ball, they both came in at the same time in 2003 as starters, as true freshman starters, which you don't see a whole lot anymore. And maybe it was because I was living in Georgia, but the two quarterbacks you heard about a lot, as far as there being a lot of high expectations for, were Chris Leak out of Florida, Reggie Ball out of Georgia Tech. Chris Leak did end up getting a national championship, but in his senior season, he had to kind of compete with Tim Tebow a little bit. Next up, Timmy Chang out of Hawaii. I loved watching Timmy Chang at Hawaii. Timmy Chang's actually their head coach now at Hawaii, and my hope is that eventually he will get Hawaii back to giving you a reason to stay up late at night on Saturdays, because that's what my dad and I used to do. We used to stay up late, watch Hawaii play football, because Timmy Chang was going to do something crazy in that game with June Jones and that run-and-shoot offense. So I loved watching Timmy Chang play football. Jared Lorenzen, Kentucky quarterback. Now, Jared Lorenzen was kind of different. He was a left-handed quarterback. He was 285 pounds as a quarterback, and he wore number 22 for Kentucky. Now, he is not as revered as Tim Couch at Kentucky because he never had the teams around him like Tim Couch had at Kentucky. But Jared Lorenzen, he did a lot of big things for the Kentucky Wildcats. He unfortunately had some very disappointing nicknames, in my opinion, because he was a bigger guy. They never seemed to bother him, and he kind of embraced them, so I'll say them for this morning. But he was kind of known as the Hefty Lefty and the Pillsbury Throw Boy. That's what they used to call him in Kentucky. The Kentucky fans called him that. Think about that for a second. That's what they called him. I don't know if I really like that, but he never let it bother him. He went out there and he did the best he could for Kentucky. And one game that he is consistently remembered for is actually one he lost. It was a 7-overtime game against Arkansas. He is actually known as like the hero of that game, even though they didn't even win the game. But go back and watch Jared Lorenzen. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, which is sad to think about. Daryl Hackney from UAB. Again, you probably never watched a UAB game in your life up here in Messina, New York, but Daryl Hackney was that guy for UAB to get people to pay attention. Casey Clausen out of Tennessee. He had like a 34-10 record as a Tennessee quarterback, wore number 7 for them in the early 2000s. Biggest thing that he didn't do, he hardly ever played well against Georgia. That was back when it was Casey Clausen versus David Green, Tennessee and Georgia. Those were good games, but again, never really good games for Casey Clausen. Marcus Vick. Now, I included Marcus Vick on my list here because I don't think you can talk about the early 2000s quarterbacks without talking about the biggest what if in college football history, in my opinion, in Marcus Vick. Now, Marcus is the little brother of Michael Vick, and here's what you got to remember. At the time that he played for Virginia Tech, Michael Vick, his older brother, was the biggest thing in the world when it came to quarterbacks. So not only is Marcus Vick playing at his brother's alma mater, he's also under this spotlight where every time he's on the field, people are wondering, what are you going to do that's going to remind us of your brother? Think about that for a second. That's a pretty big magnifying glass that's put on you. It's never about you. It's about what can you do that reminds us of your brother. Now, I'm not saying that should excuse any of his off-the-field behavior or even some of his on-the-field behavior, but I will say that does give me a little bit of sympathy for the guy because I can't imagine having that type of microscope on you. And I said when he's on the field because he spent a lot of time off the field being suspended and things like that. And even when he was on the field, he shared time with Brian Randall at Virginia Tech. He was never the lone starting quarterback at Virginia Tech. But every time he was on the field, man, he was impressive, in my opinion. He was impressive. I think he would have done better if he would have been given the job. But I think the coaches kind of hesitated to give him the job because of some of that off-the-field stuff.